Good evening to everybody. It's nice to see a nice turnout this evening. As Chairman of Telfed, it's a great honor and privilege of me to welcome Ambassador Lenk, who is joining us this evening. It's always a pleasure to see him. Always has a lovely smiling face. And it's great when we hear interviews with him speaking, even if it's not on television, that when you know the person, you can actually visualize the person, and he always has that smiling, magnificent way of putting his words across.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for everybody coming out. It's lovely to get in front of an audience without a tan. I have to say, coming and speaking in Israel, and this is dressed up. An Israeli diplomat doesn't get that very often. And good luck to you in this new job. And the happiest man in the room tonight is Dave Bloom, who's free and wearing T-shirts and relaxed. And I was just saying to Dave a minute or two ago that just over 2 years ago, I guess it was in May or June of 2013, right before our family went off to South Africa, Dave invited me to a meeting of the board of Telfed, and some of you may have been there that night. And I think that lots of people around the room looked at me somewhat, that's a nice young man. That we're going to wipe that smile off his face. And the optimism that he's talking about, let's see what happens. And so here we are 2 years later, and the smile's still there. Because I think that if we put our perspective right on what is possible between Israel and South Africa, the glass is much more half full than it's half empty. And the question is where do you look at it? And if you are imagining somehow something that I think is totally wrong, and look back on those glory days 30 years ago in South Africa, where Israel and South Africa were close and partnering, the truth is it wasn't that may have been nice for the Israeli ambassador back then. But it was a bad time in South Africa, and it wasn't really, in a holistic sense, good for Israel or for the Jewish people. And so in the world of 2015, emphasizing what's possible is, I think, the job of an Israeli diplomat, wherever he or she is serving. But obviously, I'm going to emphasize my time in South Africa. And you can be negative if you want to look at that. Right? You see the signs, I don't know how much you can see or across the screen, but they're all different signs, whether on Facebook or on Twitter or banners, trying to get me kicked out of South Africa. And or you can even, there's a lady, a somewhat well-known journalist, holding up a sign that says, "Boycott Israel, Ambassador Lenk must go." And so on Twitter, the next day I responded by tweeting to her, saying, "Thanks for spelling my name correctly. I'll see you around." The question is am I going to let her or them win? And the answer, of course, is no. Instead, we look into our bag. And these are gift bags that we put together for Yom Ha'atzmaut last year and gave to all of the guests who came to our reception in Pretoria. But what do we fill up in the bag that is the relationship between Israel and South Africa? What's there? What can Israel do for South Africa? What can South Africa do for Israel? And the more that we emphasize those different issues, the less anyone's listening to somebody coming out with a sign like that or a Facebook page that just talks about negativity. And so just this is going to be a little bit harder to read, just in 4 sentences of what the mission of the Israel Embassy to South Africa. The first sentence says that we're promoting the interests of Israel in those countries, and in South Africa, Lesotho, Mauritius, and Swaziland. And what does that mean? It means the interest is certainly central on our interactions with the Jewish community, our brothers and sisters in South Africa, and promoting diplomatic and business ties for Israel. We obviously need to have an active public diplomacy outreach program in which we share information and understanding about the people and the achievements of Israel, and I'll talk about that as we go along. And obviously the embassy provides consular and other services to Israelis and other people. That's it. 4 sentences, that's what we do in South Africa. And so here's 2 examples of amazing, wonderful Israeli-South African partnership. The left, you can see it's a package of 6 tomatoes branded as Israeli tomatoes. Sold at Woolworths. Where are they from?
Israel.
No, they're from Limpopo. They're grown by ZZ2, the largest vegetable grower in South Africa, using seedlings created and grown in Limpopo by Shivtei, the Israeli agricultural company. But interestingly, they're branded nevertheless at Woolworths as Israeli tomatoes. It's sort of counterintuitive. If you think that South Africans don't like Israel, why in the world would Woolworths do it? But the truth is they don't do it because they're Jewish or because they're Zionist or because the owners of Woolworths are my friends. But because they did market research and found out that the shopper at Woolworths, when they see a tomato branded as Israeli tomato, sees them as high quality. They're the most expensive, top quality tomatoes that Woolworths sells. And so they want the consumer to identify those tomatoes with Israel. Similarly, it's hard to see that there are farsamonim, right? They're persimmons on the right, branded in South Africa as Sharon fruit, because people didn't know the fruit persimmons until a decade ago when the Israeli company Moore, right, Mem Vav Lesh, which is the largest by far, a farsamon grower here in Israel. But persimmons, when during the year do you get persimmons in Israel? Anybody? Autumn, in the autumn, after the Chagim. October, November, December is a farsamon season in Israel. More export, and you'll see the season's coming up pretty soon. You'll see them in the shops, but more exports 93% of the persimmons that they grow to Germany and to France. And that's where they make their money. But they had a dilemma. They can only grow persimmons 3 months, 2 months, 3 months a year. And somebody said, you know what? The seasons in South Africa are different. If we grew persimmons using Israeli technology and Israeli ideas and Israeli marketing and using to sell to our same customers in France and in Germany and sell them to them in the autumn in South Africa when they grow, right, which is March, April, May, we're going to double our season. We already have the market share. Our German and French customers will buy them anyway. They don't care what time of year. And in fact, we'll be able to get a bigger profit because they'll be off season. And so in Swellendam, in the Western Cape, there are acres and acres of orchards that grow a farsamonim that are Israeli South African partnerships. Both of these examples are bringing Israeli technologies and techniques, creating jobs, creating opportunities, and creating profits both for Israeli companies and their South African partners. And so the haters of Israel say, oh, there he goes, the Israeli ambassador, talking about tomatoes again. But they're right. I am going off talking about tomatoes again because tomatoes create jobs, create technology, create opportunities for South Africans, and because ZZ2 has a 64-65% market share in South Africa on tomatoes, basically if you want to boycott Israel in South Africa, it's time to take tomatoes out of your sun. Nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to do it. And so the South Africa-Israeli partnership works there. Another, perhaps more famous to all of us example is Netafim, right? The world's largest drip irrigation company. They have a factory also in the Western Cape, just outside of in Kraaifontein. Kraaifontein, just outside of Stellenbosch. Manufacturing there the pipes, creating a secondary company called VegTech 2000, which makes greenhouses all over the Western Cape and in other regions of that part of South Africa. They've created 400 or 500 farms over the years, and often export those Netafim pipings that are made now product of South Africa to countries that don't want to buy something that's product of Israel. Well, the truth is the product may be product of South Africa, the profits come back here to Israel. And again, 300 people work for Netafim in South Africa, more job creation, more technology, more knowledge on water use. That's something that South Africa needs that we in Israel have succeeded on. This photograph is an interesting one. It's from almost exactly a year ago, the first week of August last year during the war in Gaza, both in Johannesburg and in Cape Town, there were huge rallies that reached the news here. I was interviewed on Arutz Stein the night of the rally in Johannesburg. And what was wonderful about those two rallies was it wasn't just the Jews. It wasn't. If you look at this photograph, you can see people holding up Israeli flags and South African flags. There are Jews and Christians, blacks and whites, people from all different backgrounds that identify with the connection that is Israel. And I put a biblical quote just to emphasize that idea that there are Christians all over South Africa that see themselves as friends with Israel, that connect to Israel. South Africa is a massively Christian country. And so one of the things that the Jewish community has gotten better at in recent years is finding allies. If you're just dependent on the Jewish community of South Africa to be the lobby for Israel-South African relations, it's 70,000 people in a country of 50 million people, you're lost in the demographics. But when the Zion Christian Church in Limpopo or the Shemba Church in KZN suddenly talk about the Holy Land and the connection between Christians and Jews, suddenly we're talking. And we're in business, and there's people who understand that there's a shared values and shared history. And so building coalitions is something that we've been finding friends where we thought there might not have been. And it's surprising to find out that there are a lot, and more. And it's always worthwhile to pull out a Mandela quote, right? And the reason it's worthwhile is because the other side tries to use it and to take words that he said or that the ANC said over the years as meaning that weren't possible. But I think that many people in this room will remember that in 1999, soon after he finished his term as president of South Africa, Madiba came here to Israel. Here's a picture of him at Yad Vashem. And the quote that I picked is a strong positive quote, emphasizing the need for a negotiated peace, a balanced one that Israel and our interests are taken into account. And a lot of the people that I've interacted with the South African government, and I'm not going to argue that it's everyone, but you may have noticed in the news over the last year or so, during the war last year, President Zuma named two envoys, a former minister and a former deputy minister, to represent him in the region to try to offer South Africa's perspective on peace in the Middle East. They visited twice over the last year, once last July during the war, and then about a month and a half ago. Constructive, positive interactions. Quietly, under the radar. Could there be more? Should there be more? Yes. I think that there's possibilities for a lot more on a government-to-government interaction. But it's not there at all. It's not in a situation that, I know someone was talking about Libya earlier tonight. We were talking about that when we were drinking coffee earlier. Between Israel and Libya, there are no relations. Between South Africa and Israel, we have embassies on the two sides. We have South Africans living in Israel and Jews in South Africa. We have $1 billion of trade in two directions every year. And in the media, there's opportunity too. You had mentioned that you heard me or saw me out and about. And so, I don't know, the first one on the top left is on SABC. And sometimes they ask hard questions and don't agree with whatever I'm trying to sell. But I'll get my points in. And I'm not going to back down or give in. And the picture below it is on the radio, and the picture on the right is of an article that I wrote that was in the Sunday Times in the wake of last summer's war. Just yesterday, an article that I wrote about visits to young South Africans to Israel was in the Daily Maverick, an online media source in South Africa. And so the takeaway here is there's room to play. Is the media pro-Israeli? I don't know what that means necessarily even. No, it's often critical. And the perspective is often different than the one that we get here, or you might get if you read in an American newspaper. But even there, people are worried sometimes and wondering about it. But if you stay at it, there's an opportunity to get our point across. And together with the Jewish community,